Chapter 25. A fresh storm gathers. There was no mistaking the fact that the Muslim state in Medina had considerably consolidated its position in Arabia. Under the Prophet's leadership, the Muslims were able to score several successes which put them in an even stronger position than they had been in after their remarkable victory at Badr. If the defeat at Uhud tempted some tribes to mount raids on groups of Muslims or try to trap them in a hopeless position, no one could any longer think of anything similar to Al-Raji or Bir Ma'unna. Indeed, neither the Quraysh nor the Jews felt that they could score a victory in an open battle against the Muslims similar to the Quraysh's victory at Uhud if they were to fight on their own. Both the Quraysh and the Jews, however, could only grow more bitter as they realized that Islam was getting stronger every day. There were certain circumstances which indicated that a new major encounter between the Muslims and their enemies was bound to come soon. One such factor was that the Quraysh had to justify itself for not turning up for its appointment with the Muslims by planning a new attack on them. The Jews of Al-Nadir, however, were the first to realize that the only chance of suppressing Islam was for its enemies to join forces in a consolidated attack which would wipe out the Muslims altogether. A group of the leaders of Al-Nadir tribe, including Salam ibn Mishkam ibn Abi al-Hukak, his cousin Kinana ibn al-Rabi ibn Abi al-Hukak, and Huyay ibn Akhtab, as well as Hoath ibn Qais and Abu Ammar of the Jewish tribe of Wail, went out of Khaybar, where the Al-Nadir had settled, to try to forge an alliance with the Quraysh and other enemies of Islam. The group went first to the Quraysh and proposed an alliance which would have the sole purpose of annihilating the Muslims. They told them, "We will fight alongside you until we exterminate Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his men." The Quraysh needed little persuasion to agree to such an alliance. They could lose nothing by it. Besides, they could only increase their own firepower when it came to actual fighting. Here is a singular incident which cannot be easily justified. Some of the Quraysh leaders were a little hesitant about the whole affair. It may be that when they reviewed their earlier encounters with the Prophet, they realized that they were always the aggressors. Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions were always fighting in defense of their lives and their new religion. They did not try to force their religion on anyone. They simply wanted to be free to convey God's message to people and let them choose whether to accept it or not. Perhaps some of them were having doubts about their own religion of idolatrous worship when they compared it to Islam, which is based on the belief in God's oneness. Hence, the Quraysh leaders addressed the Jewish chiefs, some of whom were rabbis. "You, the Jewish people, are the people of ancient scriptures. You know our quarrel with Muhammad, peace be upon him. We now want to ask you, which is better of the two religions, ours or his?" Unhesitatingly, the Jewish chiefs said to those who worshipped idols, "Your religion is certainly better than his, and you are nearer to the truth than he." How can one explain such a testimony? Obviously, the grudge, bitterness, and hostility those Jews felt towards the Prophet and Islam had blinded them totally so as to testify that pagan beliefs and the worship of statues and idols were better than believing in God, the Lord of the universe, the Creator of all. In so doing, the Jews contravened the very basis of their monotheistic religion, which shared with Islam the belief in God's oneness. The Quran denounces their attitude in strong terms. In verses 51 and 52 of Surah 4, entitled Women, "Have you not seen those who were given a portion of the scriptures, and yet they believe in sorcery and digression, and assure the unbelievers that they are better guided than the believers? It is those indeed whom God has rejected. Whomever God has rejected shall have help from no one." The Quraysh, however, were very happy to receive such a statement from the Jewish leaders, and the alliance was thus firmly established. The Jewish delegation then sought to expand the alliance in order to ensure that in their coming battle, the balance would be heavily tilted against the Muslims. They went to the tribe of Ghatafan, a major Arab tribe with several clans. They tried to persuade Ghatafan to join the alliance and were finally successful when they promised Ghatafan their entire date harvest for a whole year after they had achieved their victory against Muhammad, peace be upon him. They were also able to enlist the support of other tribes such as Sulaim, Asad, Ashja, and Fazara. When all these tribes mobilized their forces, they raised a strong army of 10,000 men, which marched towards Medina under the command of Abu Sufyan in the month of Shawwal in the 5th year of the Prophet's settlement in Medina, February AD 627. Defense Plan. When the Prophet received intelligence of the new threat which the Muslims were about to face, he consulted his companions on the best way to defend Medina against the attackers. Realizing that his companions were no match for the large army of their enemies, the Prophet felt that he had no choice but to adopt a defensive plan. Most reports suggest that it was Salman, the Persian companion of the Prophet, who suggested digging a moat around Medina, so that the attackers would be physically prevented from engaging the Muslims in an open fight. The idea was a novel one as far as fighting between Arab tribes was concerned. Arabs were used only to fighting in open space. In no previous military engagement did they ever have to build a bridgehead over a river or a similar natural barrier. This time, however, they had to face such an obstacle. The geography of Medina was perfectly suited to the execution of this idea. Only the northern parts of the city were vulnerable to attack. Other parts were naturally fortified. To the east, an old volcanic area called Vakim stretched a considerable distance, and a similar old volcanic area called Vabara stretched to the west. In the south, orchards thick with palm trees stretched over a considerable area and formed a natural barrier to any attack. Behind these fields, the Jewish tribe of Qurayza lived in fortified homes, and they were bound by their peace treaty with the Muslims. To complete the fortifications and defenses of Medina, the moat had to be only wide enough to prevent any possible crossing and deep enough to make driving across it impossible. The Prophet and his companions found the idea of digging the moat attractive, and he called on his companions to start working on it without delay. The Prophet divided his 3,000 companions, who constituted the fighting force of the Muslim state, into groups of 10, and assigned to each group a distance of 40 yards to dig. As they worked hard, the companions of the Prophet chanted suitable rhymes indicating their determination to defend their faith. By the time the allied forces of evil arrived, the Muslims' defensive plan was fully operational. The moat stood as an impregnable barrier between the two parties. It should be pointed out that the Muslims must have found the task of digging the moat rather difficult because they were not used to such manual activity. The Arabs generally worked in trade, leaving menial jobs to their slaves and servants. The Muslim community in Medina, however, was a poor community with few slaves. They, therefore, had to take part themselves in that remarkable project. The Prophet himself shared in the digging of the moat. His position was unlike that of present-day heads of state, who initiate large national projects in a spectacular ceremony designed to make use of the mass media in order to gain political advantage. The Prophet shared in the work like any individual of the Muslim community. He worked with the axe and the shovel, and he carried the soil away like every single member of his community. Once, he was so tired that he sat down to rest and leaned against a rock. As he did so, he fell asleep. His two companions, Abu Bakr and Umar, stood nearby, motioning others to move away so that they did not disturb the Prophet in his sleep. When he suddenly woke up, he said to them, "Why did you let me sleep? You should have woken me up." The Prophet's action motivated the Muslims to work as hard as they could in order to complete digging the moat in a spectacular period of 6 days. Some reports suggest that it took them 17 days, while others put the number as high as 24. Perhaps this smaller figure is more accurate, considering the urgency of the matter, with the hostile forces already on the march when the digging started. Working together in digging the moat, the Muslims felt their communal ties to be stronger than ever. Nothing cements the ties of brotherhood more than joining such a grand effort in the service of the common cause. This was markedly visible among the Muslims as they continued digging the moat. As mentioned earlier, there were in Medina a group of hypocrites who pretended to be Muslims. These people resented having to do such a menial job as digging a moat. They were always bent on seeking some excuse to absent themselves from the sight. Many of them would come for a short while, then sneak away. When their conduct was noticed by the rest of the Muslims, they were determined not to leave the site without first obtaining permission from the Prophet. Any believer who wanted to go away for any reason, even the most pressing, preferred to tell the Prophet first and ask his permission. Thus, every short absence was reported in advance. This discipline was voluntary, not imposed. God therefore praises the Muslims for their conduct and denounces the behavior of the hypocrites in the last 3 verses of Surah 24, entitled Al-Nur, or Light. A meal for an army. There were several incidents during the digging of the moat which confirmed that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was truly a prophet. As has already been pointed out, the Prophet worked in the digging of the moat as an individual among the community. As they dug, the Muslims chanted in chorus, and the Prophet joined in. The Muslims were very poor. At the time, most of them suffered from hunger. With their hard work, hunger was especially biting. Many of them used the device of putting a stone against their stomach and wrapping it tight to overcome the pangs of hunger. The Prophet had 2 stones on his stomach. As he was working, one of his companions noticed that he must have been extremely hungry. This man, Jabir ibn Abdullah, was deeply affected by the sight and sought permission for a temporary absence. He went straight home and said to his wife, "I have seen the Prophet in a condition which I cannot tolerate. Have you got any food?" She told him that she had a small quantity of barley and a small goat. He immediately slaughtered the goat and prepared it for cooking. His wife ground the barley and started to cook the goat in a large saucepan. When the cooking and baking were nearly finished, Jabir went to the Prophet and said, "Messenger of God, I have some food at home. Would you like to be my guest with 1 or 2 of your companions?" The Prophet asked him how much food he had, and when he heard Jabir's reply, he said, "This is good and plenty. Tell your wife not to take her saucepan off the fire or her bread out of the oven until I come." Then he addressed his companions and invited them to Jabir's dinner. All those digging the moat from among the Muhajirin and the Ansar went with him. In Jabir's own account of the story, he says that he was exceedingly embarrassed because his little goat and small amount of bread were very inadequate for that large number of people. He preceded everybody, went straight to his wife and said, "The Prophet has come and brought with him all the Muhajirin and the Ansar." She said, "Has he asked you what food we have?" When he answered in the affirmative, she said, "God and his messenger know better." Her answer was enough to relieve Jabir of his embarrassment. When he arrived at Jabir's house, the Prophet said to his companions, "Come inside, but do not push one another." The Prophet himself started to cut the bread, put it in dishes, and put meat on top of it. Meanwhile, he kept the pot simmering and covered it as well as the oven after taking some bread from it. He served dish after dish to his companions until they had all eaten a full meal. Both the saucepan and the oven were still full of bread and meat when everyone had finished eating. The Prophet then said to Jabir's wife, "Eat of that and send presents to other people, for we have suffered something approaching a famine." She did so and sent large quantities of bread and meat during the rest of that day. There are several reports which relate this story. Some of them put the figure of those who shared in Jabir's dinner at 800. If everyone who was working on digging the moat accepted the Prophet's invitation to Jabir's house, the number would be much higher. This is not surprising, not because a little goat, or a large one for that matter, was enough to feed such a large number of people, but because God blessed that repast and gave the Prophet such a privilege at that particular time. A similar incident took place during the digging of the moat, which confirms that the Muslims in Medina were very short of food at the time when the Quraysh resolved to attack them along with other Arab tribes and the Jewish tribe of Al-Nadir. A young daughter of Bashir ibn Sa'd reported that her mother, Amra bint Rawaha, gave her a small quantity of dates and told her to take them to her father and her uncle, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, for their lunch. On her way, she passed the Prophet, who asked her what she was carrying. She replied, "Some dates my mother has sent to my father, Bashir ibn Sa'd, and my uncle, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, for their lunch." The Prophet said, "Give them to me." She put them in the Prophet's hands and noted that he could have held more. The Prophet ordered a cloth to be spread and then put the dates all over it. He asked someone nearby to invite all the people to lunch. They all came and started eating. The dates increased and increased until everybody had eaten, with the cloth still full of dates. Indicative signs. Although such incidents are signs which testify to the truth of Muhammad's message, peace be upon him, and the fact that he was a prophet and a messenger of God, they are not the basis of belief in Islam. They simply confirm an accepted truth. The best evidence of that truth is the Quran itself, God's message, which provides guidance for mankind and creates, whenever implemented, a perfect human society which is run by human beings and ensures a happy human life for everyone. That is the main proof of Muhammad's message, peace be upon him. Incidents of a miraculous nature such as have been related are of secondary importance, despite the fact that they confirmed, especially for the companions of the Prophet who witnessed them, what they had already taken for granted. Another incident which took place at that time was that a unit of the Prophet's companions complained that they had in their portion of the moat a large piece of rock which was too hard for their shovels and axes. They could do nothing about it. The Prophet said, "I am coming." He picked up an axe, hit the rock, and it turned into a heap of dust which was very easy to tackle. When the Prophet and his companions finished digging the moat, they felt much more secure in their position. The moat was too wide and too deep for any horseman to jump over. The rubble and sand left over from digging the moat were piled in a parapet which formed an additional barrier between the Muslims and their enemies. Women and children were guarded in fortified buildings. The Prophet and his fighting forces encamped at the foot of Mount Sil with their backs to the mountain. The Quraysh and the Confederate Arab tribes, which joined the army of unbelievers which marched towards Medina, had a clear motive and a definite aim. They wanted to finish Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions, leaving no trace of Islam whatsoever. Huyay ibn Akhtab and the other leaders of the Jewish tribe of Al-Nadir, who were the initiators of this alliance, and worked very hard to have it forged and to see the large army of the Confederate tribes raised, made it clear to the leaders of the Quraysh and the Ghatafan that this time they must never lose sight of their ultimate aim of exterminating the Prophet and his companions. The pledges made by all the parties involved were clear indicators that all understood the objective and agreed to it. Thus, when this large army moved towards Medina, its commanders were thinking of a total sweep of the city, leaving to the Muslims there no chance to put up any kind of resistance, which would enable Islam to survive, even with a considerably reduced following. In short, the effort they had undertaken was nothing less than a war of extermination. The picture on the other side was totally different. The Muslims were a community motivated by faith. Their newly established bonds of brotherhood, superseding all previous bonds of tribal loyalties, had given them a sense of unity which they had not experienced in the past. They trusted in the leadership of the Prophet, knowing that he was guided by God who alone could give victory to whomsoever he willed. When the Prophet called on his companions to dig the moat, in order to complete the fortification of Medina, their collective effort, hard and tiresome as it was, and undertaken at a time of famine, helped to enhance their unity and their feeling of strength. They realized that they would probably be no match for their enemy in an open fight if they were to rely solely on their own power. That, however, did not weaken them, because they trusted in God and in the leadership of the Prophet. When they settled on their defensive plan, they realized that the perseverance and steadfastness were of the highest importance if they were to win this encounter. They knew that they had to exhaust the patience of their enemies in order to draw them into making costly mistakes. In other words, their effort was largely a war of nerves. The unexpected barrier. When the Quraysh and its allies arrived and realized what the Muslims had done to defend themselves and their city, they were shocked and baffled. This plan was something they had never encountered before. They did not know how to build a bridgehead over the moat. Even if they did, their effort would be very costly in lives. They, therefore, encamped near to the moat, waiting for something to happen. Units of horsemen paraded day and night near the moat. They tried to find a weak point where a crossing could be effected. They watched for a chance to take the Muslims unawares and cross over to them. The Muslims, on the other hand, were fully aware what a breach of their defenses would mean to them. They encamped very close to the moat, and every time a unit, large or small, approached, a shower of arrows from the Muslim side forced them to retreat. The Muslims guarded their defensive lines day and night. They were alert, watchful, and determined. Muhammad ibn Maslama, a companion of the Prophet, said, "Our night was turned into day. The leaders of the unbelievers took turns to demonstrate their power on the other side of the moat. We saw Abu Sufyan leading some units of his troops beyond the moat. Then other commanders took turns each following day. Khalid ibn al-Walid, Amr ibn al-As, Hubayra ibn Ubay, Ikramah ibn Abi Jahl, and Dirar ibn al-Khattab. While this exhibition suggested that the unbelievers had great forces at their command, it also showed that there was no recognized supreme leader of the Confederates to whom they all deferred. Perhaps this was the main factor of weakness in the ranks of the unbelievers. The defenders of Medina, however, did not show any indication to that effect. They could therefore be excused their worry over the outcome of this long and drawn-out encounter. When several days had passed and the situation did not alter, a group of the Quraysh's renowned heroes tried to cross the moat. Indeed, a few of them managed to get their horses to jump over at the narrowest point. A group of Muslim fighters, led by Ali ibn Abi Talib, rushed to stop this breach and face the attackers. Those who crossed were either forced to retreat or killed. One of them, Amr ibn Abd was highly renowned for his bravery and fighting ability. Ali said to him, "Amr, you have pledged that if you were ever invited by a man from the Quraysh to accept one of two alternatives, you would certainly do so." Amr confirmed his pledge. Ali then said to him, "Then I call on you to believe in God and His Messenger and to accept Islam." Amr answered, "I have no time for that." Ali then said, "Then I challenge you to a duel." Amr said in a condescending tone, "And why do you do that, my nephew? By God, I do not want to kill you." Ali said, "But I do want to kill you." Enraged, Amr dismounted and faced Ali. The two were locked in a bitter fight, which ended with Ali, the young man, killing the hero of the unbelievers, whose bravery was no match for the courage and confidence of Ali, the trusted companion of the Prophet. All indications suggested that the siege would be prolonged. Any far-sighted person would have realized that unless the Muslim lines were breached at some point or another, the defenders would be able to survive for a long time. They were in their city and their farms were behind them. Thus, their supply lines could not be disrupted. Their position was by no means a comfortable one, but it was not desperate either. Their enemies were in a worse position. Their supply lines were virtually non-existent. They had to rely on what they had with them. Soon, that would be exhausted. They could not maintain their siege for very long. The first to realize that something dramatic must be done to break the stalemate was Huyay ibn Akhtab, the rabbi of the Jewish tribe of Al-Nadir. Of all the leading enemies of the Muslims, Huyay ibn Akhtab was perhaps the most determined to bring the whole enterprise to a successful conclusion. The whole idea of joining together all the forces hostile to Islam was his brainchild. He realized that a failure this time could be total. The deadlock had to be broken, and no one else could be trusted to come up with a suitable idea to break it. Treason by temptation. Right at the back of Medina and beyond its fields lived the Qurayza, the largest of the Jewish tribes who had settled in Medina a long time ago in anticipation of the emergence of the last of the prophets. Like the rest of the Jewish tribes, the Qurayza were bound by a peace treaty which the Prophet signed with them shortly after his settlement in Medina. So far, the Qurayza had kept to their obligations under the agreement. The other two tribes of the Kainuka and the Al-Nadir were evacuated from Medina after having violated the treaty. Hence, the Qurayza Jews feared nothing from the Muslims. Trusting that there was no danger to guard against from the Qurayza's side, the Muslims took no precautions against them. Now, Huyay ibn Akhtab realized that the only chance to achieve his goal of bringing about the collapse of Islam and the annihilation of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions, was to persuade the Qurayza to join forces with the Arab unbelievers and their Jewish allies to launch a pincer attack against the defending Muslim army. He therefore found his way to the fortified house of Ka'b ibn Asad, the Qurayza leader. The Jews in Medina lived in houses like forts. In the days before the advent of Islam, they stirred up trouble between the two main Arab tribes in Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, making alliances with both sides and joining them in their battles. Each house of theirs was fortified. In such troubled times as Medina was going through, the Jews took every precaution and locked up their fortified houses. When Huyay ibn Akhtab knocked at Ka'b ibn Asad's door, the latter refused to open up. Huyay called out to him and asked him to open, but he refused, saying, "Huyay, you're a man of ill fortune. I have a treaty with Muhammad, peace be upon him, which I intend to observe. I have seen nothing from him except honesty and faithful observance of his obligations." Huyay would not take no for an answer, and his entreaties to Ka'b to open the door grew more and more passionate. But Ka'b would not open his door. Eventually, Huyay deliberately insulted Ka'b to provoke him into admitting him into his home. He said, "You have bolted your door only because you do not want me to share your dinner." The trick was successful, and Ka'b admitted his unwelcome friend. When he sat down, Huyay ibn Akhtab said, "Ka'b, can you not see that I have come to bring you the glory of all time? I am giving you a sea of goodness." Ka'b inquired, "What is that?" Huyay answered, "I have brought you the Quraysh with all its chiefs and leaders right to their encamping place at Mujtama al-Asyal, where all streams converge. I have also brought the Ghatafan with all their chiefs and leaders right to where they are encamping close to the Mount of Uhud. Both have given me their most solemn pledges that they will not depart until we have annihilated Muhammad, peace be upon him, and all his followers." Ka'b answered, "You have indeed come to me with an everlasting shame. You bring me nothing but a cloud, which has already shed its rain. It may produce lightning and thunder, but it has nothing good to offer. Leave me alone, Huyay, for I have seen nothing from Muhammad, peace be upon him, but honesty and faithful observance of our treaty." A man from the Qurayza called Amr ibn Sa'd put in a few good words. He reminded his people of the treaty they had with the Prophet and that they were required under that treaty to support Muhammad, peace be upon him, against his enemies. He then said, "If you do not want to fight with Muhammad, peace be upon him, then leave him alone to face his enemies." Huyay ibn Akhtab was not deterred by this negative answer. His power of persuasion was indeed great. He kept pressurizing and persuading Ka'b ibn Asad until the latter yielded to the temptation of joining the allied forces hostile to the Prophet. In return, Huyay pledged to him by God that if the Quraysh and the Ghatafan were to leave before they could inflict a defeat on Muhammad, peace be upon him, he and the Jews under his command would join Ka'b ibn Asad and the Qurayza in their fortified houses and share with them their fate, whatever that fate might be. When that was done, the Qurayza followed their leader Ka'b ibn Asad in his unilateral abrogation of their treaty with the Muslims. The Prophet soon heard of the treachery of the Qurayza. He was aware that if the news became known to the Muslim army, it was bound to have adverse effects on their morale. He therefore wanted to be absolutely sure of the new situation. He sent 4 of his companions, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, the chief of the Aus tribe, Sa'd ibn Ubadah, the chief of the Khazraj tribe, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, and Khawat ibn Jubair, to the Qurayza to ascertain their position. "If you find out that the intelligence we have received is true, give me a hint, which I will understand. Try to avoid affecting the Muslims' morale. If, on the other hand, you find that the Qurayza remain faithful to their treaty with us, make the news known to everyone. the delegation went to the Qurayza and met the people there, calling on them to maintain their peaceful relations and to confirm their alliance with the Prophet. The Qurayza, however, took a defiant attitude. They said, "You want us to confirm the alliance now when we have been weakened by the evacuation of Al-Nadir? Who is God's messenger? We do not know him." Sa'd ibn Ubadah abused them, and they returned the abuse. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh told them, "We have not come here for this. The matter is much more serious than entering into a slanging match with them." Then he said to them, "Qurayza, you know our past relations. I fear for you a destiny similar to that which befell Al-Nadir, or even worse." At this point, they abused him in some of the most vulgar and obscene terms. He said, "You would have been well advised to use different language." The Muslim delegation then left the Qurayza and went back to the Prophet with the bad news that the Jews no longer recognized the peace treaty which they had with them. On arrival, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh and Sa'd ibn Ubadah found the Prophet with a group of his companions. Following his advice that they should give him a hint of the Qurayza's treachery rather than give the fact full publicity, they mentioned in their report the names of the two Arab tribes, Adl and Al-Qara, in reference to the treachery they had perpetrated at Al-Raji. The Prophet was not perturbed. On the contrary, he said, "God is supreme. Rejoice, you Muslims, for the end will be a happy one." An attitude of unshaken faith. It is important to consider the attitude of the Prophet when he received the unhappy news of the Qurayza's treachery. At no time during his life did the Prophet show that he was given to fanciful ideas or carried away into the high flights of imagination. Indeed, the reverse is true. He was a very practical and realistic man. He was fully aware of what the treachery of the Qurayza meant. The Muslims were in effect besieged by two enemies who were determined to attack them on two fronts in an all-out effort to exterminate them. Yet, at the very moment when he received the news of the imminent danger, he advised his companions to rejoice, for the end would be a happy one. This reflects this total trust in God and his realization that despite the great forces of their enemies, the Muslims would be victorious if they were truly on God's side. After all, victory is given by God to those who fight for his cause with sincerity of purpose and intention. The Prophet's attitude in this case can be contrasted to his attitude when friction and conflict were about to erupt within the ranks of the Muslims after their victory in the expedition of Al-Mustalak. At that time, the hypocrites were successful in stirring up hostility. Then the Prophet was very worried and hastened to settle the differences between the Muslims. His wise, quick measures enabled him to overcome the trouble created by the hypocrites. He was genuinely worried by that incident. That shows that the Prophet considered the internal trouble much more serious than having to face the might of all forces hostile to Islam in open battle. He considered that it was enough for the Muslims to be united in their determination to fight the enemies of God and Islam and to do their utmost in that direction to be sure of God's help against their enemies. If, on the other hand, strife erupts between the Muslims themselves, then God will leave them to their own devices and will not help one group of them against the other. The Muslims soon realized that the Jews of the Qurayza had gone back on their promises and joined the campaign to wipe them out. Everyone was extremely worried and feared the outcome. Their greatest worry was that the Qurayza had easy access to Medina. They would be able to let in units of the Quraysh and their allies to join them in an attack on the civilian population of the city. Obviously, all strong and able-bodied Muslim men were with the army and only women, children, and old people were left in Medina. They could no longer be left on their own without protection. If the Muslims were to split their forces in order to fight on both fronts, their lines would be very thin and they could not resist a determined attack from either side, let alone a concerted one from both for a long period. Hence, the worry and the fear were great indeed. The Prophet tried hard to comfort the Muslims, telling them to relax and trust in God. He told them, "By him who holds my soul in his hand, God will provide you with a way out of this hardship. I indeed hope to go around the Kaaba feeling absolutely safe, and that God will enable me to hold the keys of the Kaaba in my hand. God will surely destroy the Persian and Byzantine emperors, and their treasures will be spent to further the cause of God." In this critical period, the hypocrites revealed their true feelings and the fact that they had little faith in God and the Prophet. What they wanted most was to spare themselves. Some of them came to the Prophet and asked permission to go back to their homes, which were vulnerable to attack. Some of them remarked that the Prophet was promising them the treasures of the great empires of Persia and Byzantium, when none of us feels safe even to go to the toilet. Others said that the Prophet's promises were false and tried to persuade some of the Muslims to go back home. God describes their attitude in clear terms in the account given in the Quran of this encounter between the Muslims and their enemies. This account occurs in Surah 33, entitled Al-Ahzab, or the Confederates. Only the hardcore of the true believers remained steadfast and accepted the Prophet's assurances of victory. A war of nerves. Meanwhile, Huyay ibn Akhtab went back to the command of the Quraysh with the news that the Qurayza were joining their campaign. This gave them such a boost that they were lighting great fires every night to intimidate the Muslims and weaken their morale. The Qurayza asked to be given 10 days to get ready before they could fight. One of their conditions was that in the meantime, the Quraysh and their allies would increase the pressure against the Muslims so that they could not attempt to settle with the Qurayza first. As a result, skirmishes intensified and there were repeated attacks from across the moat, which only served to emphasize that the Muslims were the weaker party. The Prophet thought hard about a way to cause a split in the enemy ranks. He thought of persuading the Ghatafan to withdraw from the alliance with the Quraysh and the Jews. He sent a messenger to Uyayna ibn Hisna of Fazara and Al-Harith ibn Auf of Murrah, the two main leaders of the Ghatafan, with an offer by which they would get 1/3 of the crops of Medina if they were to withdraw their forces from the campaign. They accepted the offer, and the text of the agreement was written. Before having the agreement signed and witnessed, the Prophet called in the two leaders of the Ansar, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh and Sa'd ibn Ubadah. He wanted to consult them about the agreement because the Ansar were the ones most affected by its provisions. When he had told them what he had proposed to the Ghatafan, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh asked him, "Is this something you would like us to do? In this case, we will accept it for your sake. Or is it something God has ordered and we shall have to accept it? Or is it something you are doing for our sake?" The Prophet answered that he was doing it for them because of their extremely difficult situation, now that all the Arabs and their allies had joined forces against them. He added that all he wanted was to break up the unity of their enemies for the present. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh said, "Messenger of God, when we were like these people, idolaters, unaware of any religion other than the worship of idols, they did not hope to get a single fruit from Medina except as a present from us, or if we sold it to them. Now that God has honored us with Islam and guided us to it and has given us the honor and strength of having you in our midst, would we willingly give them our goods? We have no need for this agreement. We will give them nothing but the sword until God makes his judgment between us." The Prophet replied, "The matter is entirely up to you." Then Sa'd took the sheet on which the agreement was written and erased the writing. He said, "Let them do their worst. We are ready to meet them." Thus, no peace was made with any party and the siege continued as hard as ever. The attempt to reach an accommodation with the Ghatafan came to nothing. There was, however, an indirect result. The Prophet was now absolutely certain of the Ansar's determination to fight to the end. There was no weakening in the Muslims' ranks. The fact that they were facing the greatest danger they had ever faced did not shake their faith. Their trust in God was as strong as ever. Nevertheless, the Muslims were facing a very difficult situation indeed. The army of the pagan Arabs of the Quraysh and the Ghatafan intensified their pressure, keeping the Muslims engaged all the time in order to give the Qurayza a chance to get ready for fighting and to prevent any attempt by the Muslims to launch a lightning attack against the Qurayza in order to restore the situation that prevailed before the Qurayza's treachery. The Quraysh and their allies were so pleased with the feat accomplished by Huyay ibn Akhtab in persuading the Qurayza to change sides that they were now absolutely certain of achieving the victory they were seeking. Skirmishes on the Quraysh front were now much more frequent. Parades of forces taken in turn by the Quraysh commanders were a daily occurrence. One has to remember here that each time a division of the enemy forces went on parade, the Muslims went on full alert. Their position was a defensive one. They, therefore, had to guard against any action their enemies might take. Every movement was watched and every eventuality was prepared for. While these parades attracted the Muslims' attention for a time, skirmishes of an ever-increasing intensity presented an imminent danger. One such engagement took place when a battalion of the Quraysh army launched an attack on the position where the Prophet himself stood. He and his companions fought hard to repel it. The fighting continued all day and well into the night. The fighting was so fierce that neither the Prophet nor any of his companions was able to offer any of the obligatory prayers on that day. All of them missed the 3 prayers of Zuhr, Asr, and Maghrib. Some reports suggest that the engagement was of a shorter duration and that the Prophet and his companions missed only the Asr prayer and offered it together with Maghrib. All reports, however, agree that prayers were missed and could be offered only after sunset. When the Prophet and his companions were ready to offer their prayers, Bilal made one call, adhan, for them all and one iqama for each one. Pressure at its highest. The Qurayza themselves took part in the systematic intensification of the pressure on the Muslims. It seems that they were creating impressions that they were ready to launch an attack on the Muslims at any moment in order to divert their attentions and make it easy for the Quraysh to cross the moat and put their plan into operation. The situation was so critical as far as the Muslims were concerned that the Prophet did not allow any of his companions to go back to Medina for any reason without carrying his full armor. This was a precaution against any trap the Qurayza might have set for the Muslim soldiers. One evening, it was reported to the Prophet that the Qurayza were about to launch a night attack on Medina and its civilian population. This was not just idle talk. The Prophet had to treat the report seriously. He sent 2 units of his companions to guard Medina that night. The first unit of 200 men was commanded by Salama ibn Aslam and assigned the task of guarding one side of the city. The other unit was even larger. Zayd ibn Haritha commanded 300 men and was given the task of providing a guard for the rest of Medina. Some of the Prophet's companions described the difficulty of their situation in those days by saying that they were much more worried about their women and children being attacked by the Qurayza than about facing the much larger force of the Quraysh and the Ghatafan. It was apparently a time when every moment brought something to worry about. The Jews of the Qurayza had easy access to Medina, and apparently they sent some of their men to frighten the Muslim women and children. One of them was killed by Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib, the Prophet's aunt, when she saw the man moving suspiciously very close to the quarters of the Muslim women. All courage and caution. It is useful to relate the following example in order to have a feeling of the thoughts and feelings of the Muslims in that period. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, the leader of the Aus tribe of the Ansar, was apparently attending to some business in his home, obviously with the Prophet's permission. When he was ready to go back, he waited a little for a friend of his called Hamal ibn Sadana. He was chanting a few words which described that particular situation. Tarry a while, and Hamal will take part in the fighting. Death is welcome if one's end is due. His mother was urging him not to wait. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, who related this incident, was with his mother. In her account, she remarked that the body armor Sa'd was wearing was not as good as it should have been. It left him with one arm totally unshielded. She said to his mother, "I wish that Sa'd had a better shield." She feared that he might be hit on the arm. When Sa'd joined the army that day, he took part in one of the engagements that had become very frequent. He was hit on the arm by an arrow. Apparently, his wound was very deep. Sa'd, so keen to see Islam well established in Arabia after the defeat of its enemies, prayed to God in these words, "My Lord, if we are to fight the Quraysh again, spare me now for that fight. There are no people I like to fight for your cause more than those who have opposed your messenger, rejected him, and forced him out of his hometown. If you have willed that this encounter between us would be the last, I pray you, my Lord, to make this wound of mine my way to martyrdom. But spare me until I see our affair with the Qurayza have a happy ending for Islam." Saad's earnest prayer describes fully the Muslims' feelings in their very difficult situation. However, they had done everything in their power to defend the cause of Islam. They neither weakened nor allowed their worry and fear to dictate their behavior. They continued to do as the Prophet bade them, trusting that the outcome would be in their favor as long as they were ready to continue to give their utmost. They had learnt from the Prophet that was all that God asked anyone to give. When any group of people had given that and have done all they can for the sake of God, God takes over and gives them victory in the way He pleases. In the Islamic view, victory in war is given only by God. When two armies meet in battle, the decisive factor which determines the outcome of that battle is God's help, which He gives only to those who serve His cause. If both armies turn their backs on the cause of God and do not recognize it, He abandons them both to their own devices and lets the laws of nature, which He has set and determined, produce the result on the basis of their interaction. One may indeed say that the interaction of the laws of nature determines the outcome of any battle between any two armies, provided that we include among these laws of nature the one which determines that those who believe in God, live their faith, and practice it in their daily lives are entitled to be helped by God. This help is their right, which He Himself has given them. He has committed Himself to helping His servants whenever they fight His and their enemy, setting for themselves the only objective of serving His cause. With this law, which supersedes all others, victory is always assured to the believers. Islam requires its adherents to exert every effort and to do their utmost for the achievement of victory for Islam. They must not set their aim as the achievement of victory for themselves. Their personalities do not matter. What matters is the victory of the cause, regardless of who achieves it. After all, that cause is God's, not theirs. Their role is to serve it as best as they can and let God do with it, and for it, what He wills. That unique generation of Muslims, the Prophet's companions, understood this principle very well and acted on it. Every time they met their enemies, they prayed God to give them either one of the two great prizes, victory or martyrdom. It must be emphasized that fatalism is alien to the Islamic concept of life. Muslims do not go to war thinking that victory is guaranteed them by the fact that they are Muslims. They must do their own duty, exerting their best efforts to achieve victory before they can earn God's help. As the Muslims with the Prophet continued their defense of Medina, in this encounter known in the history books as the Expedition of the Moat, or the encounter with the Confederates, they were able to demonstrate most convincingly that their aims were absolutely free of any gain they might have sought for themselves. For 27 nights, they remained under siege, with hostile forces close to them, threatening to attack them on two fronts, hoping to put an end to Islam altogether. Worrying about their faith, their families, and the Prophet, those Muslims did not think about their own lives. All they were thinking about was what they could do to ensure that the call of Islam would continue to spread. When they were attacked, they fought hard. None of them thought about his own safety. Indeed, their women and children were always urging them on, encouraging them to do that little bit more. War is but a trick. In such a situation, God's help is always assured. Those Muslims were required to continue to exert their best efforts, and victory was theirs. One can detect that victory was achieved only with the help of God. When one realizes that those circumstances which helped achieve that victory could not have happened at that time, in that place, and in that particular way, all by coincidence. It was all the work of God. When He willed that those Muslims should reap the fruits of their efforts, He caused a man from the Ghatafan tribe to come to the Prophet. This man, Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud, was apparently a highly intelligent and resourceful person who had formed many friendships and acquaintances with all sorts of people. He said to the Prophet, "Messenger of God, I am now a Muslim, and my people are not aware of the fact. You may give me whatever orders you wish." Keenly aware that the thing which the Muslims needed most was for their enemy to split ranks, the Prophet said to Nuaym, "If you join us, you increase our number by 1, but try, if you can, to dissuade the people from attacking us. War is but a successful trick." Nuaym was the right person to bring about a split in the ranks of the enemies of Islam. He had many friends among the Jews of the Qurayza who were getting ready to attack the Muslims from behind. He went to them and said, "You know that I love you truly and that I am a good friend of yours." They replied, "Indeed, your friendship to us is undoubted." He said, "The Quraysh and the Ghatafan are not in the same position as you. This city is your own home city where you live with your own women and children and have all your assets and property. The Quraysh and the Ghatafan have come to attack Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions, and you have now joined them. But their women and children and their money and property are somewhere else. This places them in a position different from yours. If they have an opportunity to seize, they will not fail to seize it. But if things turn sour for them, they will certainly depart and leave you alone to face Muhammad, peace be upon him, in your own hometown. If you are to face him alone, you are certainly no match for him. My advice to you is to guard against that eventuality. You must not fight alongside the Quraysh and the Ghatafan unless you take some hostages from among their leaders, so that you may be absolutely sure that they will fight with you until Muhammad, peace be upon him, is defeated." The Qurayza recognized the validity of Nuaym's argument and thanked him for his advice. Leaving the Qurayza, Nuaym went straight to the Quraysh encampments where he met the overall leader, Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, and the other chiefs. He said to them, "You know me to be your friend and that I am no follower of Muhammad, peace be upon him. I have come to know something which I feel I must convey to you as a piece of advice, but please do not tell anyone that I am your source of information." Having obtained Abu Sufyan's promise, Nuaym continued, "I would like you to know that the Jews have repented their breach of their treaty with Muhammad, peace be upon him. They sent him messengers to communicate to him their regret for what they had done. In order to show him their goodwill, they asked whether he would be satisfied if they were to give him a number of men from among the nobility of the Quraysh and the Ghatafan to kill. They also promised that they were ready to fight with him against you until you have been exterminated. He answered that their offer was satisfactory. Now, if the Jews ask you to send some of your people to stay with them as a guarantee that you will not abandon them, do not send them a single person." Nuaym then went straight to the Ghatafan and said to their leaders, "You are my own people whom I love most dearly. I believe I am not a man you suspect of any ill will towards you." When they assured him of his good standing among them, he told them the same thing he told the Quraysh and warned them against sending anyone to the Qurayza. In this way, Nuaym was successful in planting suspicion among the 3 major groupings of the forces hostile to Islam. Each side wanted to make absolutely sure of the intentions of the other. Abu Sufyan and the chiefs of the Ghatafan sent a delegation to the Qurayza led by Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl with representatives from both tribes. It so happened that the delegation went on the Sabbath night. It had totally escaped Abu Sufyan's notice that the Jews of the Qurayza were very strict in observing their Sabbath. The delegation said to the Qurayza, "This siege has caused us so much trouble. We cannot maintain it much longer. We are getting exhausted, so we have to make a move. Get ready and let us attack Muhammad, peace be upon him, and finish him off with his companions." The Qurayza answered, "You are surely aware that today is our Sabbath day, when we do nothing. Some of us, in former times, violated the sanctity of this day and were subjected to God's punishment, of which you are aware. This point apart, we cannot fight Muhammad, peace be upon him, alongside you, unless you give us some of your own people to stay with us, so that we are absolutely sure that you are as determined as we are to fight Muhammad, peace be upon him, to the bitter end. We fear that if you find the going hard and if the fighting goes against you, you will depart and go home, leaving us to face the man in our hometown while we are no match for him on our own." When the delegation went back with this message, both the Quraysh and the Ghatafan concluded, Nu'aym ibn Masud's report is certainly true. They sent the Qurayza a message that they were not prepared to send them a single person. If you want to fight, then come out and fight. Receiving this message, the Qurayza concluded that Nu'aym's advice was right and valid. Messages were exchanged between the two sides, but neither of them was willing to accept the other's condition. Thus, Nu'aym ibn Masud was the means by which God caused this split in the ranks of the enemy forces. There was no longer any chance of a double-fronted attack on the Muslims. The army besieging Medina was in a worse position than that with which it started. The 27-day siege did not weaken the Muslims. Besides, the great hopes which the enemy came to cherish when the Qurayza pledged in active support and participation in battle were now shattered. The besieging forces had to rely on their own strength. Perhaps it is worth repeating that the circumstances which combined to produce this split in the ranks of the enemies of Islam could not have occurred by chance. They were the work of God, who decided to help the Muslims after they had proved that their faith was unshakable and that they were ready to fight for the cause of Islam, no matter what sacrifice they were called upon to make. The split in the enemy ranks was the first part of the help God gave to the Muslims at that point in time. It was also through His help that the siege of Medina was ended. The campaign is aborted. Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman, a companion of the Prophet who belonged to the Ansar, was with a group of people in the city of Kufa in Iraq many years later when he was asked by someone from that city, "Did your people really see God's messenger, and were you truly in his company?" When Hudhayfa answered in the affirmative, the man asked, "How did you serve him?" Hudhayfa said, "We used to try our best." The man said, "Had it been our fortune to be his companion, we would not have let him walk. We would have carried him on our shoulders." Hudhayfa wanted to give the man an idea of what it really meant to be a companion of the Prophet. He related the following incident which took place on the night when the Quraysh and the Ghatafan realized that their mission was destined for total failure. It was a night when very strong winds blew over the forces hostile to Islam. The night was extremely dark and very cold. The unbelievers could not light a fire because of the wind and rain. They were unable to cook because their pots and pans were being turned upside down by the wind. Their tents began to collapse, and they were worried that the Muslims might attack them that very night. In this atmosphere, thoughts of departed started to creep into their minds. Back in the Muslim camp, the Prophet stood up praying for a part of the night. He then turned to his companions and asked, "Who is willing to go and find out what our enemies are doing and come back?" To come back was a condition the Prophet attached to that particular mission. "I shall pray God to make any volunteer for this mission my companion in heaven." Although nothing is more tempting to a Muslim than being admitted to heaven in companionship with the Prophet, the conditions which prevailed that night were far from encouraging. Hudhayfa continued, "No one volunteered because of our great fear and hunger in that very cold night. When no one answered, the Prophet called me to come forward. I then had no choice but to go. He said to me, 'Hudhayfa, go inside the camp of those people and find out what they are doing. Do not do anything on your own initiative until you come back.' I went into their quarters to see the wind and God's other soldiers playing havoc in that camp. No pot or pan stood upright. No fire could be maintained, and no structure stood up. Abu Sufyan then addressed his people. 'People of the Quraysh, let everyone make sure of the person sitting next to him.' I took the man next to me by the hand and asked him who he was. He answered me, mentioning his name and his father's name. Abu Sufyan then said, 'People of the Quraysh, you realize that we cannot stay much longer. We have endured great hardship, and the Jews of the Qurayza have not fulfilled their promises to us. Indeed, we have received highly disturbing reports about their attitude. You see what these strong winds are doing to us? We cannot stay much longer in these conditions. And my advice to you is to go back home where I am going.' He then mounted his camel, which was tied to a peg. He hit the camel, which jumped to its feet and released itself as it stood up. Had it not been for the Prophet's clear instructions to me that I must not do anything serious before I went back, I could have killed Abu Sufyan with my arrow." Hudhaifa then went back to the Prophet with his report. He found the Prophet praying and sat very close to him. Continuing his prayers, the Prophet drew Hudhaifa closer to him until he was sitting between his legs, and he covered him with his robe. When he finished his prayers, he listened to Hudhaifa's report. The Ghatafan, the other tribe of the pagan Arabs who mounted the siege of Medina, decided to follow suit when they learned that the Quraysh were leaving. In the morning, the Muslims looked around them and found that their enemies had gone. All their forces had disappeared. To the believers, this was decisive evidence that they were supported and protected by God Himself. Their faith in the truthfulness of His message was now much greater. It was clear to them that they had only to carry out their part of the deal they had made with God, that is, do their best in the service of Islam, and He would surely fulfill to them His promise to always give them the upper hand over their enemies. This encounter with the enemies of Islam was not a battle in the straightforward sense. It was, however, a war of nerves and a great test. For this reason, the believers passed the test comfortably while the hypocrites failed. The worry, fear, and weakness of the hypocrites were more than matched by the perseverance, endurance, and courage of the believers, who were certain that God would soon ease their difficulty. When they passed the test so remarkably well, they found God by His grace helping them out of their difficulty and causing their enemy to flee. The whole episode is recorded in the Quran in God's own words in the surah entitled Al-Ahzab, or the Confederates. Verses 9 to 27 of the surah refer to the various stages of this encounter between the Muslims and their enemies and draw lessons for all Muslims in successive generations in order that they can follow in the footsteps of their forefathers in any period of great difficulty. Here is a translation of the verse which speaks of the conclusion of the encounter. Believers, call to mind the blessings which God bestowed on you at the time when enemy hosts came down upon you, whereupon we let loose against them a storm, wind, and other forces which you could not see. 33:9. When the Prophet looked at the now deserted place where the enemies of Islam had encamped, he felt that it was only through God's grace that the Muslims were saved. His companions recognized in his looks a feeling of great hope and great confidence in God. He looked at them and said, "Now we will no longer be on the defensive. They will not attack us again." In complete humbleness before God, the Prophet repeated the following words which Muslims always repeat, especially on their happy occasions. "There is no deity other than God, who has fulfilled His promise, given victory to His servant, and dignity to His soldiers, and who has defeated the Confederates single-handed. No one was before Him, and no one remains after Him."